Every great hero needs that inverse that gives him that great foil. For Spider-Man, it's the Human Spider. For Superman, it's Bizarro. Well, for Batman, it's the Man-Bat. That didn't take much thought, did it? For those unfamiliar with the character, he's pretty much like this tragic Frankenstein's monster type of villain slash anti-hero that makes up one of the characters in Batman's rogue gallery of villains. However, he's a little different than the rest. This was actually a scientist, Dr. Kirk Langstrom, who was trying to give himself supersonic abilities through the serum that he concocted. Unfortunately, it had some side effects that turned him into a bat-like anthropomorphic creature. This in turn gave us a couple of iterations throughout the comics, and also one of the biggest fantasy moments in Arkham Knight. So McFarlane Toys decided to tackle the character through a DC Rebirth version in Megafig form here, and frankly I feel like there's quite an awful lot of great, but with some caveats that keep this from reaching its full potential, which did kind of hurt me as I kind of played with the figure and navigated him and kind of tested him out with different poses and different things, because he really, much like with an awful lot of the Mega figures throughout this line, at least some of the most recent releases from McFarlane, he leaves an impression. He really does. Getting him out of the box and just witnessing the insurmountable size of him is crazy. But what's also very striking is the amount of detail and sculpt that McFarlane was not able to cheap out on. Specifically, the way that the musculature and the detail on the fur and on his head really punches across very well. I really dug that they went with a much more slightly comic bookish look to this version of Man-Bat, because he retains that DC Rebirth kind of aesthetic, and because of that, he's gonna have insurmountable amounts of fur around his neck, at least what I like to call his mane, his shoulders, back, and even his chest. And the way that they were able to etch out the individual fibers of the hair and of the fur really work well. I would arguably say that that's actually one of my favorite parts about the sculpture, but beyond that, it's also the different veins and the muscles that you can kind of see throughout the arms, chest, and ab area. It really does look monstrous, and because of that, it works in favor of the figure. Plus, that wingspan is incredibly just impressionable. Just the way that it's able to give him horizontal range because of the way that those wings are archetypal to the character, and they feel really good and sculpted really well, but at the same time they're not too rigid that if you give them a slight press, or if he's like up on the shelf or something like that, he's not going to be at risk of either knocking other figures. You can kind of compress the wings into themselves, and there's even an extra little wing here on the back of his tricep that just adds to the detail. It adds to the impression, to the overall look of the character, and because of that, like I said, this is actually one of the best looking Megafigs in quite some time that not only have I handled, because I've already dealt with a handful of Megafigs already on the channel, but just in the matter of McFarlane Toys in general, especially with the DC Multiverse line, this is frankly one of the ones that's just one of the lookers. Like, it's one of the ones that if you come across him at a GameStop or at a Target, you're likely going to stop where you're at in the shelf and be like, yo, that's a Man-Bat. And one of the elements that really helps sells that is the face and the sculpt detail around the head, because Man-Bat, if he doesn't look intimidating or scary, then you're kind of doing a bit of a disservice to the character. And fortunately, they were able to nail it with the head sculpt here that looks very terrifying, but working with the scale that they did and with the quality that they did without ever stepping into anything that's very premium, that's gonna be holding up to that premium price, they were able to do a very spectacular job. With that being said, it's also the head sculpt, or the headpiece rather, that brought another little issue to my attention as I kind of laser focused on the figure and picked it apart and analyzed it, was that unfortunately I feel, and this could be considered a nitpick, but I do see varying degrees of textures going throughout the figure that I don't know how certain I feel about them. For example, the head. There's certain areas where I do like the look of the face sculpt, especially with the red eyes there, but I don't like how glistening the ears are. I kind of wish that they had taken a much more matted approach to the way that the skin skin texture that kind of looks like around the ears. And then that brought to my attention the kind of glossy and slimy look of the abdominal area, as well as some of the arms. I feel like some of those little areas could have had a little bit more of a skin-like matted texture, because unlike Titan Joker, who's supposed to look a little slimy because they're kind of injected with the Titan formula and they're supposed to look all sickly, Man-Bat is not the case. He's supposed to be something much more crossbred with an animal that has a tendency to have a much more natural surface. That then led me to the detailing and the sculpture of the pants. The pants, at first glance, looked pretty good up until I got a little closer and noticed that the matte texturing around the rubber piece of the kind of like waist area that's supposed to be flexible to allow articulation to move is of a completely different texture than that of the rest of the legs. So as a nitpicker and someone who kind of suffers from OCD, it just kind of stood out to me as something that, like I said, someone who kind of takes collecting these figures seriously, it just kind of bothered me ever so slightly. But I have to give them some appreciation for the little rips and tears that you can kind of see throughout the pants that expose a little bit of the skin underneath, kind of delivering on that monstrous image and that Frankenstein value that I was kind of mentioning at the beginning. I also mentioned that the wingspan gives him that monstrous presence, especially since for a character like Man-Bat, you gotta nail the wings. You gotta nail that bat-like kind of aesthetic to the creature, and they really do sell it on that. I just feel like it came at a bit of a compromise, because despite having very horizontal range and kind of delivering on that quality of a mega figure, he's lacking a little bit in that height. And one of the things that kind of brought to my attention about his lack of height, especially over some other most recent Megafigs that I've covered, such as even Titan Joker, or let alone Killer Croc from the Arkham Asylum series, which I think is even slightly taller than Man-Bat here, is because they went for this kind of hunched over look to the character, where he's got kind of like the ankles and the calves bent at an angle, and on top of that he's kind of slouching towards the front, and it's kind of having like this hump to his overall body composition. And I understand that that's supposed to lend to the character because he's supposed to be a monster. He's supposed to be kind of lungering over, and he's not supposed to be standing up or upright all the way across, all the way up to the ceiling. I get that, but there's just something about the slouchiness that I wish could have been fixed by the articulation, and unfortunately that doesn't necessarily happen because the articulation is kind of a mixed bag. Let's start off with some of the good. You got some really great joints at the top of the arms that allow great mobility all the way around, especially when you extend them to the sides, especially because it shows how well they decided to sculpt out the wings. I was kind of expecting them to interfere with each other when moving the arms in bulk, but as you can see, they're actually rather flexible, especially vertically rotating them. The only thing that kind of hinders it a little bit is the rubberized piece of the hair and the fur here around the shoulder area, but just give it a little bit of a press and you'll notice that it kind of bends it and it's flexible enough to allow full rotation to happen. Then you do have a nice kind of like beam across the neck down to the baseline of his head, with part of his mane kind of circumventing around it, allowing full possibility of the head and the neck area, not only to be able to pivot slightly up and down, but also allow the head to rotate in place 360 degrees and even kind of give him a little bit of that kind of expression going on right there. You get some decent ab crunch and torso articulation with a mid-cut crunch and cut right there that allows it to fully rotate 360 degrees and even crunch a little bit more than I was expecting it to. Not much in the way of flexibility towards the back, but that's actually where the waist kind of comes into play. I actually noticed that the waist is able to extend farther back than the mid-cut. Just be careful that it exposes a little bit of the joint there, kind of behind the rubberized belt area, and then full rotation at the waist is also very well appreciated. But things start to get a little testy when we get to those knees as well as those top leg joints. Extension towards the front and the back at the top of the legs is a little tense, especially because of that rubberized piece across the groin. I don't know what it is, but it's just so squicky and tense that it's difficult to move any of those joints in almost any kind of direction, whether it be front, back. You can kind kind of hear it a little bit there, as well as extensions towards the sides. It feels ever so slightly limited. Then we get to the knees. That kind of scared me because of the way that they were sculpted. I felt like they were very limited and rigid, but they do bend at the two joints. You just kind of have to give them a little bit of a press in order to get any of them moving, because on my first go around, it felt like only one joint was being pressed, and then the other one was pretty stagnant because of the way everything was kind of sculpted around that area. The toesies are pretty decent. They kind of remind me a little bit of the ones from Titan Joker, where they pretty much gave the toe cut pretty much halfway through the foot, so it's not really a toesies joint, it's more so of a mid-foot joint. But as I took a closer look, I noticed that they decided to give him the same ankle joints as Duke Thomas, the ones that I was kind of raving about, and I was hoping more McFarlanes would incorporate into their figures. It looks like they're going in the right direction, because Man-Bat is able to replicate them here, allowing the ankles to very flexibly and fluidly rotate the ankle at 360 degrees, as well as pivot up and down very fluidly, like I mentioned, and it feels really good to do so because of the way that they built that joint, allowing one of the pieces to kind of cut halfway through and allow it to move without ever feeling like it's kind of restricted in any form of direction. It is once we get to the arms, at least the forearms specifically, where we get into some very conflicting forms of opinion, because for one, there are no wrist joints whatsoever. They're completely stagnant. There's absolutely no wrist articulation. It's probably my first McFarlane toy that I've ever come across, whether it be a Megafig or a standard 7-inch, with no wrist articulation. And I get it, because of the way that they had to sculpt out the wingspan here, the plastic wing piece, and attach it to the forearms. That was physically impossible. Like they were not going to be able to do that, and that's kind of where a little bit of that head joint articulation comes into play to kind of give him a bit more flexibility there. I understand that. It's once we get to the elbows that things just still take a little bit of a back seat, because he's got one joint that bends at the 90 degrees. So when I saw that, my instinct was to say, okay, so much like with some other recent figures, especially Killer Croc, he's gonna have some form of elbow swivel. So they didn't have the bicep one. They're gonna be able to give him a swivel here at the top of the elbow to allow it to rotate horizontally 360 degrees, and it is there. But there's an issue. He's only able to really rotate into the body. When it comes to rotating outwards, that's not gonna happen because of the way that this other little wing piece attached to his tricep is sculpted. It's kind of getting in the way of the much larger wing span piece, and because of that, bending it in that direction is physically impossible. So it's pretty much frozen within the arm area, and that kind of left me with a bad impression. Per tradition of McFarlane and their Megafigs, that he's obviously not going to come with any accessories, minus the traditional black base and trading card. So with that, I'll say this, that I understand how some people were very, very excited for a Man-Bat figure, especially one that was going to be treated with the Megafig style in terms of size, proportion, and sculpting. And there's definitely something really, really positive to say about that there. And it's, like I mentioned before, it's definitely an impressionable looker that feels great in hand, looks great up on the shelf. But if you're looking for any form of very flexible posability, if you're like a professional photographer, and most especially a YouTube content creator that was hoping to get some great B-roll shots of this thing, it's gonna be a little difficult considering how stagnant the arms are. And if you're someone who's as nitpicky as me when it comes to uniformity as far as textures are concerned, there's going to be some conflicting areas amongst the sculpt here that are going to look great in some spaces and then some mixed ones in others, such as the pants. But overall, for one of the characters that I'm glad to see is getting some recognition here, it's still a very worthwhile figure, especially if you can find them at an affordable price. So because of that, I'm going to be giving the Megafig DC Rebirth McFarlane Toys Man-Bat an 8 out of 10. And if you guys want to add them to your collection without having to go to scalpers and still catch it while it's at regular MSRP, check out the links in the description below. That help with the channel quite a bit. And of course, if you guys want to see some more McFarlane toy reviews or anything Batman or Spider-Man related for that matter on the channel, be sure to tune in, subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you on the next one. In the meantime though, stay humble.